Thank you very much, Dr. Sharif, and welcome to everyone who's joining us virtually. Of course, AmCham events are one of the most exciting ones, and I love to participate in them. I wish we could all sit together over lunch, which is our typical AmCham setting, but I'm very happy that at least we have colleagues who are joining us from the US, and this is one of the merits of being able to do virtual meetings, which we are all getting more and more used to these days. A few opening remarks, and it goes back to the title that AmCham has put for the talk today. COVID-19 is a pandemic that has actually pushed us all in different ways. And I think the overarching theme of this pandemic is really humility. All of us are being challenged in different ways, and all of us are very humble in the way we need to think about this. And through this humility, we are becoming more innovative. We are pushing more the frontiers of collaboration, coordination. When you say there's the opportunity of multilateralism, I think no country in the globe today is by itself. All of us, whether we're policymakers, we're citizens, we're in the private sector, we're in the government, everybody is being affected by this in a very similar way. So nobody is excluded. And that sense actually pushes forward the agenda of multilateralism, where common problems need global solutions. So everyone, while they are taking their actions locally, it adds up to improving the global picture. I took over this ministry in December, and the vision of this ministry, or what it needs to do, or what it has been doing, is actually strengthening Egypt's relationships, both on the bilateral side and the multilateral side, particularly with development partners. And this involves not just the international institutions, it involves the private sector, it involves civil society, and also global thought leaders. The crisis today has put more urgency when it comes to the enhancement of dialogue between us, other countries in the world, and other institutions. Everybody is trying to put together coordinated plans, whether on the health side or the economic side. And a few years ago, when there was that debate whether or not markets were becoming more decoupled, I think what we are learning today is that markets are very coupled. There is a huge element of complementarity, which helps at some times, but also has increased the challenges as well. The way I want to do my talk today, and there's a presentation that will be sent to all of the participants after the conclusion of our meeting. And in that presentation, as Dr. Sharif had mentioned, I'm going to tackle two issues. First, it's Egypt's response and rebuild strategy for COVID. And the second one is the partnerships narrative that we launched, and I want to speak to all of you about, because it also involves not just a narrative from the government side and our development partners, but it also is a narrative that we will develop with our private sector colleagues, whether they are in the US, whether they're Egyptian private sector, etc. So if we can start the presentation, and I hope it shows up on the screen so all of us can take a look at it. I hope I don't take more than 15 minutes, and then we can open it up for questions, because I think many of you have questions as well. So as I mentioned, we'll be splitting it up into the response and rebuild, and then the new global partnership narrative that we have put together. So as a government of Egypt, we came out and the policies were really based on protecting the population from the spread of the virus through different measures that I will go over. Provide easier access to credit to both the households to smooth consumption, but also liquidity for firms to survive the disruption that is happening not just locally, but also globally. And then always thinking about the future, progressing by expediting structural reforms through and beyond COVID-19. So this is really the strategy that we have. And of course, we have been hearing over the past 2 months, all of us, flattening the curve. And flattening the curve, there are actually two curves. The curve that is related to the health, and then there's, of course, the curve that is related to the recession. And I'll be talking about the measures that the government has taken on both sides. If we take a look at what we've done on the health side, we are today day number 75 from patient zero. And when we take a look at this time map, we will find that early testing took place. There was many cases of isolating people who were infected very early on. Then there was the halting of flights to and from Egypt. The tourists had to leave, and they left in an orderly way. They were tested. Those who had symptoms and were COVID positive were quarantined before they were let to go back home. Of course, the education today is taking place from home. And that is another challenge which shows, and I'm going to explain that a little bit, where our engagement with development partners has actually brought fruits that showed up in this crisis. And then we have actions from the central bank which were extremely important, related to cutting interest rates and other measures that I'll be speaking about briefly. And of course, the government took action when it came to working from home. And for everyone who knows how big the Egyptian civil service is, this, of course, is an extremely novel way, but again, it pushed the government to implement policies that maybe a few months before were deemed to be quite difficult. There was also closure of malls, and then the curfew, and of course, most recently, the curfew in Ramadan was a little bit alleviated. Next, we can see that, again, a few other areas that were enhanced for the health side. 27 laboratories across the country. There was a scale-up of infection prevention and control programs with WHO, expanding the capacity to conduct over 200,000 tests within 2 weeks. There was also 8 isolation hospitals set up, 2,000 bed capacity, and 1,000 for ICUs, 400 ventilators. So there's a whole list of issues and measures that the Ministry of Health, with the help of the government and also several partners, we were able to implement. And also we find that WHO, in its monitoring of the situation in Egypt, there were more than one testimony on how it was handled. And I think that for those who have been following, very early on, the protocol that was followed by the Ministry of Health and the Minister of Health herself followed very much many of the protocols that were set out by the WHO. In the presentation, you'll find that we give a little bit more detail on some of the also digital elements that the Ministry of Health took on, whether it was to train some of the staff and also to keep us all briefed. I think each one of us waits 8 p.m. every day to learn how many new cases are there, how many recoveries are there. So there is this engagement, if you will, that is also taking place, and it's very important. And what we have seen globally is that transparency around what has happened with respect to cases, etc., is something that is extremely important, not just to fight it, but also to create some sanity among global citizens. Again, several testaments from WHO on the measures that were taken by the Egyptian government and its leadership in tackling the pandemic. Of course, education, and here all education systems globally have been tested. The idea of moving to virtual classrooms, etc., is something which is becoming more mainstream rather than the exception. And the Ministry of Education, through our partnership with the World Bank and other international institutions, had over the past period engaged in a reform program for students to be more engaged technically and digitally. And this has actually been very timely, in the sense that many of these reforms have been expedited, and we can see that classrooms, etc., and so on is happening through these digital tools. Then we come next and we take a look at the macroeconomic impact. There was, of course, all of us are spending so much of our time following what comes out on Bloomberg, what comes out from McKinsey, what comes out from different analysis, what's happening globally, etc. When we take a look just on a briefly, and this keeps on changing and getting deeper and getting more intense as we go through additional weeks without a vaccine. There's been a disruption, of course, in trade and transport, and that has affected global value chains globally. Then we have, of course, the manufacturing and production cycles, and that came definitely at the very beginning when China had to close down, given that it started there first, and how it affected factors of production in other countries. Then, of course, the leading sectors in many countries globally, such as tourism, transportation, aviation, major sources of revenue for both for developing and emerging markets, were very hard hit. And then capital flight from markets was and is being witnessed. And of course, that adds more to the debt burden not just for small and medium enterprises, but also for more mature multinationals. So there's this whole cycle that is taking place, demand side disruptions and supply side disruptions feeding each other. Of course, the oil prices is another big issue when it came to the engagement that happened with OPEC Plus, and then the prices that we've seen in the US, Texas prices. This was almost a week ago. So this whole evolving situation around oil also creates a lot of uncertainty and affects not just prices for commodity producing countries, but also for countries that are thinking about investments. It does affect investments in this particular sector, and therefore for our region that is quite significant. When we take a look at Egypt in terms of the local implications, of course, it's very important to underscore, and this is a fact. We entered this crisis with very strong fiscal and foreign reserve buffers, and Egypt had a very successful and elaborate program with the IMF that started in 2016 and was concluded in the summer of 2019. And because of those cushions, and because of both on the fiscal side and with respect to reserves, that really provided ammunition as we are entering this situation. When we take a look at the numbers in 2019, remittances, which is 10% of GDP, brought in around $26 billion. Tourism, 5% of GDP, brought in $13 billion. Suez Canal revenues, of course, around $6 billion. Changes in oil prices also affect us quite a bit. And then the increase in commodity import prices related to food and supplies is something else that also creates a downside risk. So what have we done? And here I want to talk a little bit about this flattening the recession curve. And when countries and policymakers are thinking about the recession curve, the three policies that always are at disposal: monetary policy, fiscal policy, which are quite fast in terms of implementation, and then we have structural policies or structural measures that take place. And how you mix these three policies is really what is going to dictate how fast you flatten the recession curve, or how you try and mitigate many of the implications that we find. And here, when we take a look at the government of Egypt and the central bank taking measures to try and contain the economic implications of the pandemic, and particularly to support the private sector, we find that more than $100 billion pounds were put out as help to mitigate the impact of COVID. 188 million pounds for the Ministry of Health and Population in order to mitigate the impact, wages and bonuses for the doctors and the medical staff that, of course, all of us globally are saluting were also increased. There was a look at postponing payments on real estate taxes, particularly for tourism establishments and others, to basically try and alleviate the cost of production and help on the fiscal side, lifting administrative reservations on the financiers also for unsettled tax dues, again, to provide that space for companies and so on. And then cutting the dividend tax for companies on the stock exchange was also some other measure that was taken. So here we try to put a summary of some of the key measures on the fiscal side. On the monetary side, we had lowering of the interest rates by 300 basis points. And then, of course, credit dues for companies and individuals were delayed for 6 months. Court cases between the CBE and indebted clients also being waived. And then supportive interest rates for various sectors were also introduced, whether they're on the industrial sector and, of course, tourism, given the implications. And also the initiative included the agricultural sector, which is very, very important and key, given the importance of supplies and food security. Other measures that were taken, and all of these details will be given out, so we don't have to go over all of them, but tourism financing initiatives, extremely important. And again, that is one of the sectors that is mostly hard hit globally, with aviation, of course. Real estate development, again, for middle income groups, there was a fund created for that. The stock market, the central bank entered with a financial package to help some of the battering that happened on the stock market. And then labor taxes also, increasing the exemption limits was something that was taken into account for the low and middle income groups. Healthcare, we talked about the bonuses that were given. When it comes to agriculture financing, the purchase of local wheat from local farmers, and that was extremely important early on. Egypt is one of the biggest importers of wheat, and it was very important to ensure that as we are increasing our strategic stock from global resources, but also locally, that is being taken care of as well. When it comes to other issues related to sectoral support for health, education, social solidarity, there was also funds available for that. And that is something that is also very key. And other sectors related to trade and exports, and these are very important sectors for Egypt, and it was very important to provide as much as possible support. So of course the cost or the price of gas for companies for the lines of production were brought down as well. There was a reduction of the price of electricity, postponement of real estate tax payments, and then providing export subsidies. So there was a combination of measures that were taken to protect some of these sectors. And then, there is always a silver lining in these crises, and there is one in the case of Egypt particularly. And that silver lining, to me, is really as we are preparing for the future, many measures and many structural reforms that were going to be implemented were sort of put on an expedited track or a fast track, and those are ones related to social reforms, trying to mitigate the impact on the unorganized labor or the informal sector, putting forward a social protection and social safety net agenda, expediting financial inclusion reform agenda, and all of us saw some of the very important measures that the central bank took on that front and will continue taking going forward. So this is also quite important. And then on women empowerment or women economic empowerment, there was also a few measures taken from the government side on that. When we take a look on mitigating the impact on the informal sector, there is a committee set up where and here I have to really say that also in crises, the coordination, not just between international institutions and themselves or between governments and international institutions, but even within government itself, the level of coordination and cooperation and the speed by which decisions have to be made and also pushed among different ministries is happening on a very, I would say, seamless way, and this is extremely important. So we have a committee that takes a look at the informal sector and the social safety nets that exists, and here there were many issues related to, for example, preferential interest rates for SMEs, industry, tourism, and housing for low and middle income households. In terms of the debt relief, there was also initiatives for individuals at risk of default, and extending and waiving their payments. And then regulations issued last year requiring banks to obtain detailed information on clients has also been relaxed. And then when we look at the putting forward the social protection and social safety agenda, there was the one-off monetary compensation to informal sectors that was provided, and this committee that was set up was to ensure that this labor is registered, and that is where structural reforms have been expedited to within this digital framework, so that they are well identified. And this is quite significant. So we have at least a registration of 1 million were added for that, and then we have the increase in payments to women community leaders as well, given the importance of women and being identified also as one of the vulnerable groups. So we have social assistance, social insurance, and then there was the pension that was also increased by 14%. So these are some of the social measures that were taken. When we take a look at financial inclusion and digital reform, this all, in terms of registering the informal sector, in terms of expanding the social safety nets, etc., all of this is happening through more financial inclusion. So we have some of these measures that were initiated by central banks' decisions in March related to payment facilitation, mobile wallets being the daily limits being increased, banking products being enhanced. There's also the digital banking and internet banking services that were also basically pushed up. So these are all elements that have helped and will continue to help and be enhanced going forward. Then comes the gender parity, or the women issue, and this is quite important because Egypt is the first country to actually come out with women or COVID women-related policies. This has been put together by the National Council of Women. Not only that, but there's also a policy tracker that takes a look at the government policies related particularly to women, to family planning, and as it relates to different issues related to impact on human endowment, how different NGOs are brought in, the impact when it comes to economic opportunities, and then compiling the data set when it comes to the disability, age, etc., so that also certain programs can be provided at this time for women. So this is policies to protect and prioritize women is something that the government was very, very keen on. And then pushing forward for positive impact, we have again, more has been done in terms of assuring accessibility of family planning methods. There's also intensity with precautionary measures for women's shelters, and when it comes to sectoral support, increasing the number of women that have access to soft loans and loans with very low interest rates. So these are just some. There's a whole list of these policies that the National Council of Women has put out, and I can also send that to the organizers to share with everyone. And then I started something when I was a Minister of Tourism with the World Economic Forum, and we finalized it as when I became Minister of International Cooperation, and that is Egypt is the first country in the Middle East and North Africa, and Africa actually, to engage with the World Economic Forum in closing the gender gap accelerator. And this is a public-private collaboration model, and it's set out to take a proactive action in advancing women's economic empowerment. Today, of course, given COVID and given the implications on women, the way this Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator will be is it's going to be the hub where we are able to take a look more at the SMEs that are affected, led by women. We're going to be able to look at particular sectors, and the accelerator is actually a partnership between World Economic Forum, Ministry of International Cooperation, National Council of Women on the public side, but then on the private sector side, we also have sectors represented and chairs from the private sector. And this is an extremely important initiative, and we will be coming back to AmCham to provide maybe a whole session on Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator and see how the different sectors and the different companies can actually participate in this as well. You know, one very important aspect for us as policymakers is to try and not get too swollen up by the COVID and forget that there is a life after COVID, and that there are very important policies and actions that need to take place to ensure that the goals, the SDG goals and other goals are not forgotten about. So actually we don't want COVID-19 to derail us from pushing forward with our SDG agenda. And fulfilling the SDG agenda is both on the global scale and the local scale. So this concept of Glocal is one which is very, very important. And in our discussions with development partners, we always mention that SDGs is a global framework. It's a benchmark. Today, in the COVID world, there are some SDGs which are more emphasized than others, but at the same time, as we are looking through the next 6 months, as we are looking through the next year, we should always be mindful of policies that help us push forward rather than overlook this very, very important agenda. Next, so this is what I wanted to speak about when it came to COVID and the responses, and I know that there will be many questions, so I'll be answering them as they come up. But something else which is quite important is the new global partnership narrative. On April 2nd, I convened a meeting, a virtual meeting as well. I also was preparing a very big event, but unfortunately we could not conduct it. So it was a virtual meeting. We had more than 120 participants and more than 40 of our multilateral and bilateral partners with us. And the idea of having a global partnership narrative really is to try and streamline Egypt's story. Egypt has a very important development story. It is one that the government has put out, but we were able to achieve it through partnership with international institutions, with our bilateral development partners. And it's one story that we want to be able to highlight this cooperation. And the new narrative aims to contribute to ensuring that the promotion of our future collaboration is based on an up-to-date, consistent, complete narrative between the government of Egypt and its multilateral and bilateral development partners, which is generated through strong connections and engagement. So this is the objective of this narrative. And what we want to do is to basically build a brand awareness, not just for the Ministry of International Cooperation, but also for our partners. When I came as Minister of International Cooperation, I was actually taken aback by the amount of work in terms of projects, in terms of SDGs, in terms of coverage that Egypt has done with its partners in fulfilling the SDG agenda. And I felt that that story is one which is not told in its fullest, either domestically or globally. And the idea of this is together we can put and illustrate how public and private partnerships are taking place, and how we are not just talking about past stories, but there will be new ones told. Now the urgency related to gender issues or social safety nets or health are quite urgent and will happen. But how do we tell that story? How do we engage the youth in Egypt also to be excited around development stories. So the idea is shift the mindset. It's an opportunity to create purposeful and meaningful conversations with our audience, and we want people to become advocates of what is happening. And these, showcasing agile and relevant experiences, it's not only for development-minded people, but we're really interested in people coming in with us and becoming interested in human development. We're not selling a product to them, but we are building for them, and we want to communicate to them and also include them in the story. And there are very beautiful examples. Maybe in a different session we can go over some of those as well. What is the level of engagement that we see? And I met with the American Chamber in Washington when I was there end of February. And I told them that also a lot of the American firms in Egypt, when they come in with their investments, they do a lot that is also not told. It's not just about doing a project in oil or doing a project in a consumer good, but there's so much happening around, how many Egyptians have you employed, what type of training is being provided, the know-how that exists in the country. So there is a narrative that needs to come around, not just between the government and its development partners, but also the private sector. I also want to have at some point a meeting on that, because it's very important that the private sector that has come in and voted with their feet and has done work for many, many years provide its story, not just as a profit and loss and so on, but really there's a people element and a purpose element related to those stories and to those investments. So this comes to the partnership narrative itself, and it's going to be PMP, and it's not public-private partnership, but in the spirit of it, it's people and projects and purpose. So everything that takes place, any project that takes place when we initiated with a development partner, whether a multilateral or a bilateral, we have people at the core, because we are serving the people, trying to invest in people as a top priority, contributing to human capital, and trying to improve people's lives and try and identify and overcome existing gaps. So this is a key component. Even when there's a company doing an investment in the country, again, whether it's providing a certain product domestically or exporting or employing, it's people at the end of the day, which are at the core of that investment. Then comes projects and projects and actions. Projects have taken place in the country in different sectors: education, transportation, sanitation, water salination, renewable energy, entrepreneurship, etc. So all these projects have been quite significant, quite diversified, and they continue. And it's very important to explain transparently what these projects are about and get people to know them, because they have played very important roles. And then purpose as the driver. The partnership with purpose have been the driver to generate sustained and inclusive growth. The world is changing very rapidly, and therefore we have to be agile. We have to be agile as well in telling our story. And for every project, there are several SDGs that are being tackled. So identifying those, repeating that message, explaining it, engaging people around it. And also when I talk about the private sector and companies that do investments in a country, they also have, whether you are trying to alleviate poverty, or you're trying to do something in the agricultural sector, or you're trying to employ more women, etc. So there's so much and so much richness that can be explained and elaborated in different ways. So this is a brochure that we also distributed in our event on April 2nd. So it's people at the core, projects in action, purpose as the driver. And then what we did is we took the projects that the Ministry of International Cooperation is responsible for. There are around 247 projects, a total bill of $25 billion. And then we tried to map them across the different SDGs. So we see that affordable and clean energy is one of the biggest ones, but here again, and this gives us a very nice map of how much financing has been allocated to the different SDGs. And as we move forward in our discussions with our development partners, we can again try and see where we want to add more emphasis, etc. And maybe just to conclude, COVID is really a global humanitarian challenge, and as I mentioned, every one of us is being humbled by its magnitude and how it's been affecting the way we think and the way we operate. But nonetheless, as policymakers, as governments, we have to be hopeful. We have to be helpful. Because that's the only way that we can, help the community and push forward. And Egypt is not new to crises. We've shown resilience over the past decade. I remember my days at the central bank when the global financial crisis happened in 2008, and then 2011, and then 2013, and et cetera, et cetera. So at each moment in time, you're being challenged in a different way. It's a mini crisis, it's a global crisis, it's a domestic, it's a transformation, whatever you want to call it or label it. But at the end of the day, it's through our multilateral and bilateral partnership and the development story that we want to showcase together with this new narrative that we will be able to move forward. As much as this is a very tough time for everyone, I think there's huge opportunity moving forward, opportunity to engage locally, opportunity to engage with our partners of development, and this is what we are working very hard on doing. Thank you very much.